G'day, Mike Kelly again from Frontlines and Faultlines. Welcome back to the program where we'll continue our discussion about information warfare and the nature of the challenge we face in these critical contemporary times. We're going to hear again from Mike Jensen, who's just been so valuable to listen to. So we'll get straight back into it. Thanks, Mike. And coming back, of course, to one of the key topics of the moment in terms of the Gaza conflict and so the reporting that's come out of there, we've watched a lot of apologies being issued by the BBC and ABC from time to time of them uplifting, digesting some of these falsified social media product, etc. And then there's the whole statistics battle, which has been through various debates and I guess surfacing some of the falsehoods involved in it, but also the not telling the full story. Mm-hmm. So if you say there are X thousand casualties, well, how many of those are actually Hamas combatants at the end of the day, for example? But also there's this issue of, what's a journalist and who are the media outlets, the mainstream ones, taking their feed from? Because none of them are on the ground in Gaza. And so is this, non-curated material being aired cluelessly or unquestioningly? And just recently the BBC had to pull a whole documentary that they'd done when just an ordinary citizen in the UK did some digging and was able to surface all of these manufactured elements and skewed elements of that documentary. So the whole thing had to be pulled. And this was the BBC, sort of built a trusted brand over the years. So what do you see the dynamic going there in Gaza? What are the factors we should be aware of in trying to assess information coming out of Gaza?
Well, I think we need to be, alert to the fact that most of the information that we get in a war zone, particularly like what's happening in Gaza, it's not a place where there are independent journalists on the ground who are assessing the information. So the information comes to us from sources that have a particular interest in promoting a narrative about their side in the war, either as a side that's winning versus a side that's losing, either a side that's, maybe the victim or the, pointing, to another side as the perpetrator of some sort of terrible thing being done. Mm-hmm. And absent the ability to have like on the ground reporting, it's really hard. And it's probably a mistake to go without providing, independent sourcing for evidence on this to kind of just take various figures or take accounts as the truth of the matter, because that's being put out there not just for informational purposes, that's being put out there to try to produce an effect on international audiences, including, foreign leaders, as well as international publics. If they can get their message across in a way that's favorable to them, that makes it harder for the leaders of those countries to take action that's contrary to what their people think ought to be the case.
Right. And so traditionally, too, with terrorist organizations, like their first line of operation is the propaganda effort, so to speak, and they've all studied in detail how those activities and lines of operations have been executed historically. And so, do you see that as being a factor here? I mean, the joining of the dots in the Middle East seems to be totally absent with the role of Iran and its galaxy of proxies with Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, elements in Syria and Iraq. It seems to be there's an absence of doing that kind of joining of dots and deeper analysis of what's going on.
So I think back to a story I heard from an American commander in the Afghan theater about this. He said that when the U.S. and its allies carried out an attack, they would plan the attack, and then they would say to the information team, develop the information operation that accompanies our attack. Right. Whereas the Taliban would sit there and say, okay, we are going to do this operation to achieve a specific information effect, and then they would develop the kinetic operation that would produce that information effect.
Right.
So it's the inverse of the thinking that we in the political Western world have in those contexts. And I think we see this as well a lot with other actors in the Middle East, where the focus is on those information weapons, because let's face it, we have an overmatch often in terms of the kind of kinetic firepower aspect of the conflict. but they can get a lot of value for money out of the information aspect of the conflict.
Right.
And, there have been so many wars that, the United States has fought and not prevailed in. And the puzzlement is we won every battle on the battlefield. How did we lose this?
Yep.
We lost it in the information domain.
Yeah. In fact, I think that was a conversation that occurred between a US colonel and a North Vietnamese veteran at one point. And I think the US colonel said to him that very line,
Right.
We never lost a battle in that war. And the response from the North Vietnamese veteran was, that is true, but it's also irrelevant. So, and this is the thing, it's, I guess, a concern that we talk about asymmetric warfare, and quite often I see those conversations relate to an example would be, say, the Ukraine able to sink half the Black Sea Fleet without, owning warships. And so in the kinetic sort of balance they're referring to in saying asymmetric warfare, but not really factoring in this whole information warfare piece as part of that asymmetric challenge that we face.
Right. I mean, the information aspect either, sits as a standalone operation where they'll, hack and leak something, or that is an adjunct to any other aspect of a state trying to exercise its power, whether it's military, diplomatic, or applying various forms of, economic sanctions and so forth. There's always that information aspect, which is trying to tell audiences, this is what it means. And this is why you should think that this is important, and this is how you should react to it.
Right. And I've also read, an analysis that effectively with the way that these autocracies are running their strategic information warfare campaigns at present, pioneered by the Russians, as we talked about in the previous episode, that part of the mission, even if people don't believe in the end what's being put out there, if you've achieved the result that they're skeptical about all news and they start switching off and become apathetic or cynical, skeptical about anything they hear, that's a good outcome for them too. And you can see, there may be some truth to that, at least as it plays out in the US, for example, that so many people now are prepared to believe or not to believe a lot of things that seem to be obvious from outside, but they'll think that something is a lie about Donald Trump or something is just propaganda from various sources, so that they just choose to basically fall back on their own sources of information and make their own judgments.
One of the most powerful things that's available in a democracy is for a political leader to draw upon the people and say, these people are behind me. And when you can demoralize a public, when you can divide them, make them very polarized, confuse them so they don't know what to believe. I mean, there was a line from a French sociologist, Jacques Ellul, who wrote in his book on propaganda that, you don't inform a person more by giving them more information, you drown them. And that effectively, that kind of malaise of, I don't know what to believe, is one of the consequences when you put out lots of confusing and contradictory claims. And as a consequence, if it were the case then that there was something terrible that a foreign actor was trying to perpetrate in your country, but you don't know, you're not going to go out there to the streets and say, this is a problem, we must make this stop. You're not going to write your members of parliament and say, we need to be on guard against this. And the political leaders of the country will not be able to marshal and mobilize them in a form of resistance to these actors that may be, for example, seeking to divide different authorities and to use one faction of authorities against another to achieve a tactical or strategic effect in our own country.
Right. Well, look, that then brings us, I guess, to the topic of, what do we do about all of this? And we talked initially too about the threat to liberal democracy in the fact that, 71% of the world now lives under autocracies. It's an increase over the last 10 years from where it was 10 years ago. It was only 48%. So it's a serious threat. And we talked about how it's perverting mechanisms of the United Nations that are reflecting these autocracies as being their key constituencies, etc. And so, let's talk a little bit about how we fight back. And in the last program, I mentioned that there were 3 research projects that the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency in the United States is running with at the moment. One to tackle deep fake AI generated stuff, how they technically deal with that, and the other are, mapping influencing campaigns and how do you do sense making and awareness raising. So 3 different projects. And then there's been a focus on, with the schools, particularly teaching kids to do critical thinking and source evaluation, which isn't systematic by any means at the moment. So these are some of the measures that are being put in place. What do you think of those? And also, do you think the Trump administration will continue with those DARPA efforts if they become aware of them? And also, are there any other options we could be pursuing to fight this battle?
Well, first of all, on the Trump administration question, let's keep that on the down low, just in case they have any thoughts about that. Yeah. In terms of broader questions about, are those activities good? I think they absolutely are. I mean, we talk about conventionally in security terms, there's 2 main ways to exert deterrence. You have deterrence to the threat of some sort of reciprocating punishment, or you have deterrence through denial. That is, something is really hard then for an adversary to carry out. To the extent that we have a citizenry that's better able to engage information sources and more critically evaluates information and messages and messengers, we're in a much better position. For example, the Finns are well known for teaching this kind of media literacy from a very young age,
right?
And increasing their resilience to these kinds of malign actions. In terms of the programs to identify deep fakes, certainly. I think that's important because it's kind of a cat and mouse game. There will be certain technologies that will identify a specific set of signatures that are common or maybe by necessity appear within something that's the product of generative AI. But you could imagine then a subsequent revolution in generative AI could produce something that gets around those particular detection signatures. And so we'll be constantly trying to up the ante on this. And that's a particularly important issue for 2 reasons. The first is they usually use this technology to generate images and videos. And images and videos are often the kind of truth makers that we use in the process of fact-checking something. So then if you have competing videos of a talk that was given or a situation, what do you do with that? And it gets back to the earlier question about, this idea of, the public just being confused with all kinds of contradictory images and information. In the end, you don't know what to believe. So I think it's critically important that, we continue to go forward with those kinds of technologies and not just, this was flagged as being, generated by artificial intelligence, but to also have mechanisms by which we can actively combat it. Platforms that maybe streamline the processes to block this kind of content from appearing. And it gets back to this channel mechanism. The talk about, on one hand, you could say this is a form of censorship. On the other hand, I would say that free speech doesn't exist in an absolute sense, because at the point you ask, well, what's the purpose of free speech? If it's so that people can participate freely in a society and autonomously form their opinions and wills about what ought to be done politically, these kinds of deceptive acts make it more difficult for people to connect their preferences with the opinions they articulate and the decisions they make regarding the organization of political life in their society. And so in that sense, I think there's a democratic justification for those kinds of limitations. And this is why I think, a lot of those people scream, oh, it's censorship, hogwash, because it's only censorship to the extent that we are keeping people from trying to deceive other people. And there's no intrinsically good value to, deception, at least from a democratic perspective.
Right.
And then, when it comes to broader trends, I think, in part, we worry a lot about trying to keep the malign information from seeping into our information environment. To a certain extent, it's like trying to put the genie back in the bottle. Across the board, governments, political parties, and other sources of trusted information in society need to up their game to more effectively compete in that space so that their message can prevail. I mean, I'm reminded of the old statement from Aristotle and his rhetoric, where he talks about, truth is a decisive advantage in the course of any argument. I'm not sure that's true anymore. Hannah Arendt, on the other hand, notes that falsehoods often are more effective because you can craft a neatly fitting, persuasive, comfortable narrative of falsity, and you don't have to be concerned so much about the facts of the matter because people are likely to believe it because they want to believe it. And the truth is just utterly complicated and doesn't offer itself as something that's desired as a matter of belief. And so I think, we need to be more effective as communicators, be that people at universities, people in the news media, people across government departments, to kind of be on guard about what's going on out there so that their truth of the situation can at least stand a chance of competing in that information environment.
And it seems that's definitely proven in terms of that point you make by, I guess, the Middle East situation in Australia in particular. I mean, I think the foreign influence dimensions of always looking for a fault line to exploit. In some countries that's been fairly obvious, and in the US we know that they were exploiting and pitching Black Lives Matter up against white supremacists, etc. In Australia, it was a bit harder to find fault lines. The yes referendum was a good opportunity, but I guess the Middle East situation has provided another one, and they seem to have focused on what might have been called the progressive side of society. But it seems in that debate, you do see this polarization being played out where, to your point, people don't want to challenge any view that they might have personally and open their ears and their minds to having a debate and having an acceptance of the complexity and making determinations on the basis of lack of knowledge and research on complex situations. So it seems that they're now retiring into this comfort zone of, this is what I think's going on. This is what the people that I talk to and socialize with think that's going on. And if I don't actually agree with them, I may be sort of isolated or marginalized by them. There seems to be a more aggressive sort of approach to even these discussions in many ways. And we've seen that play out on a lot of university campuses where lecturers have been boycotted, their classrooms invaded, etc. So on the one hand, asserting free speech to demonstrate, but denying free speech in many of these university contexts as well. So that seems to be a particularly disturbing trend. Do you think that is, an issue that's playing out in Australia now with this polarization? And do you think university campuses need to be facing up to that reality and doing more about it?
So unpack, two aspects of that. One is that question about free speech, censorship there, where, there is a contradiction where, when you have classrooms that are invaded and various people shot down or shouted down for their opinions, that itself is a form of suppressing speech of people that you don't agree with. It's not, simply free speech to shout somebody down or intervene or interfere in their ability to communicate, because that creates dynamics where only one side can be heard and there's no capacity for reasoned deliberation or engagement with a particular topic. On the other hand, you have a situation where it gets back to that earlier discussion that we had about this idea of, people are looking for that kind of black and white, clear narrative where you have heroes and villains. And I think that has a source in the increasing insecurity a lot of people feel today. We feel insecurities for a lot of reasons, especially younger generations, sometimes referred to as a precariat. They're in a very precarious position,
Right.
given the changes in the economy. I talk to my students in classes. Very few of them feel like they'll be able to own a house in the next 20 years. This isn't the story of our parents' generation, where these things were, more reachable to achieve, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Right.
So they're looking for something that kind of to feel a part of a narrative where they can position themselves in relation to a depicted hero and against a depicted villain. And that can be at least reassuring, because whatever else may be going on in life that's a problem, the difficulties you may face, at least you're fighting the right battle. You're on the right side of history. And if you start to engage in the complexity of these things, well, that narrative starts to unravel.
Right.
And so there's an aversion to that oftentimes. That's why you find these kind of, these, sometimes they're referred to as echo chambers, especially in online contexts, where people get continuous streams of reaffirming messages about we're on the right side, we're fighting the right battle, and so forth. And it's politically interesting to see, well, all right, take, for instance, the situation in the Middle East. Israel suffered the worst single-day attack and, killing of Jewish people since the Holocaust. Do we have, encampments on, university campuses protesting Hamas? When they talk about freeing Gaza, well, we talk about first freeing Gaza from the tyranny of a group that, was anything but democratic, in which, these kind of progressive views that the protesters speak about, particularly when they're decrying the tyranny of universities that are trying to limit their ability to disrupt classes and other things like that. That wouldn't be tolerated for 1 minute.
It seems to be counterintuitive too when we talk about progressive society and what the things that we would like to advance, like women's rights, the safety and security and advancement of rights for LGBTQI plus people, for free trade unionism, free elections. All these things mean something, and for people to be supporting something that's antithetical to that seems to be really counterintuitive. But what I think was the most shocking out of that was the fact that the systematic rape and the gratuitous and sadistic sexual mutilation that occurred on October the 7th on such a scale, so horrifying. In Iraq, I saw, the beheadings and the torture chambers in Fallujah, etc., but nothing like what happened on October the 7th. I mean, the details of it are so horrific that it's hard to describe them, and, even more difficult to show the evidence of it in, standard programming on television. Just not possible to do. And so people don't get to see that reality, but to deny it utterly, and for women's organisations not to have rallied thoroughly around that issue and condemning it was, I think, deeply disturbing. So, these are the issues that we face now. I think we've set, I guess, a platform to have these deeper discussions as we go forward onto these contextual situations that are happening around the world right now. And hopefully through this program, we can make a contribution to getting facts out there, dealing with and surfacing and unpacking the complexity so that people will have a better understanding and can make more informed judgments. And two things can be true at the same time, and acknowledging that and embracing it, I think, is the one thing we would like to encourage. So thanks very much, Michael, for all of your work, your research, your powerful narratives on these things, and being fearless in surfacing the truth and the facts. And hopefully now going forward, we'll spend a bit of time looking at these particular circumstances and contexts, and looking at the historical context of how we got there, because I think that's almost always absent in a lot of the discussion, but I think very relevant to really analysing them properly and understanding them. So That's our objective. I think we've made a great start with your help in unpacking the foundation problem that we intend to deal with through this podcast. And we look forward to talking to you in the future and also being informed in what we do by your further research. So thank you very much, Michael.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Well, again, those recordings have been very valuable, and we'll be offering lots more content like this in times to come. We'll be recording them with various participants from overseas and locally. And so really encourage you to come back next time, where we'll start diving into the very rich subject matter, beginning with the Middle East context at the moment as being such a contemporary and critical one. So thanks for being with us for this session on information warfare, and we'll see you again next week.